On a rain-soaked highway just outside a quiet town, a hard-working black mechanic spots a stranded driver on the side of the road. With nothing but his jumper cables and a heart full of kindness, he stops to help a woman in distress. But 2 days later, his world is turned upside down when 2 gleaming Royces pull up in front of his modest home. What comes next will surprise you with the results of kindness. Thomas Green woke up to the soft hum of his old alarm clock. The early morning sunlight seeped through the thin curtains of his modest bedroom, casting long streaks of gold across the faded wooden floor. He stretched, letting out a deep yawn, and reached for the small digital clock on his nightstand. 5:30 a.m. It was the same time he woke up every morning, a habit he'd kept for as long as he could remember. His room was small but neatly organized. A single bed occupied one corner, covered with a faded quilt his grandmother had sewn for him years ago. On the opposite wall, a small wooden desk sat cluttered with tools, notebooks, and a few car manuals, remnants of his passion for machinery. Framed photos hung above the desk, capturing moments of his life: family barbecues, a high school football game, and snapshots of him standing proudly beside classic cars he had restored. Thomas pulled on a pair of jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, then walked barefoot into the kitchen. The house was quiet, except for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. It was a small, single-story home on the edge of Maplewood, a sleepy town where everyone knew everyone. The house wasn't much, but it was his. He had bought it a few years back, pouring every penny he had into renovations. The paint was chipped in places, and the roof sometimes leaked when it rained too hard, but it was cozy and filled with memories. As the coffee brewed, Thomas stared out the window at his backyard, a patchy lawn with a vegetable garden he had planted last spring. Rows of tomatoes, peppers, and squash stretched along the fence line. He had always found solace in working with his hands, whether fixing engines or digging in the soil. It gave him purpose, especially on the days when the weight of his dreams felt too heavy to carry. Thomas sipped his coffee slowly, savoring the rich bitterness as he mentally prepared for another day at the garage. Green's Auto Repair, where he had worked for nearly a decade, was more than just a job to him. It was his second home. Customers came not only for repairs but also for advice, conversation, and sometimes just to escape their own lives for a little while. Despite his skills and dedication, Thomas often wondered if this was all life had to offer. He had dreams, big ones. He wanted to own his own shop someday, a place where he could work on vintage cars and maybe even teach younger kids in the community about mechanics. But dreams like that required money, connections, and a bit of luck, none of which Thomas had in abundance. Still, he was grateful. After all, he'd come a long way from where he started. Growing up, life hadn't been easy. His parents had passed away when he was a teenager, leaving him to fend for himself. He had learned quickly how to work hard and survive, but the struggles had left him cautious, hesitant to believe that good fortune could ever truly find him. By the time he arrived at the garage, the sun had risen, casting a warm glow over Maplewood's main street. The garage was small and weathered, but it was always busy. The air inside smelled of motor oil, rubber, and grease, scents that Thomas found oddly comforting. He greeted his boss, Carl, with a nod and a grin before slipping into his coveralls and getting to work. Throughout the morning, he worked tirelessly, tuning engines, replacing worn-out parts, and troubleshooting electrical issues. The customers, many of whom had known Thomas since he was a kid, often stopped to chat. They admired his work ethic and trusted his judgment. For Thomas, that trust meant everything. Despite the satisfaction his work brought him, there were moments, usually in the late afternoons, when the garage quieted down, when Thomas would pause and let his thoughts drift. He'd lean against the workbench, wiping the grease from his hands, and picture the life he wished he could build. A larger garage with his name on the sign. A steady income. Maybe even a family of his own someday. But those were just dreams, and dreams didn't pay the bills. As the day wore on, Thomas finished his last repair and locked up the garage. He climbed into his old truck, the engine rumbling to life, and began the drive home. The streets of Maplewood were mostly empty by then, the fading sunlight giving way to the dim glow of streetlights. Pulling into his driveway, Thomas parked and sat for a moment, letting the day's exhaustion settle into his bones. He had done this routine countless times, but something about this evening felt different, like the calm before a storm. He didn't know that his life was about to change forever. The sky darkened as Thomas Green turned onto the winding back road that led home. Heavy clouds loomed overhead, and raindrops began to patter against the windshield of his old pickup truck. The wipers squeaked rhythmically, fighting to clear the view as the storm intensified. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his hands steady on the wheel. He knew these roads like the back of his hand, but the rain made visibility worse with every passing minute. Streetlights were sparse out here, and the world beyond his headlights was swallowed by shadows and mist. Just as he rounded a sharp bend, a pair of flashing hazard lights pierced through the downpour. Squinting through the rain, Thomas slowed his truck. A sleek black sedan was parked awkwardly on the side of the road, its front hood popped open. Next to it, a figure stood huddled under a thin denim jacket, arms wrapped tightly around herself as the rain poured down. Thomas's first instinct was to keep driving. It had been a long day, and all he wanted was to get home, dry off and relax. But something about the way the woman stood there so vulnerable and out of place in the storm made him hesitate. "Come on, Thomas," he muttered to himself. "Don't be that guy." With a sigh, he flipped on his turn signal and pulled over a few yards ahead of the stranded car. Grabbing his flashlight and an old raincoat from behind the seat, Thomas stepped out into the storm. The cold rain hit him instantly, soaking through his clothes as he jogged toward the woman. She turned as he approached, her face partially obscured by wet strands of hair sticking to her cheeks. Even through the rain and dim light, Thomas could see the relief and apprehension in her eyes. "Need some help?" he called out, raising his voice to be heard over the rain. "Yes, please," she replied, her voice trembling. "I think it's the battery. The car just died, and I can't get it to start." Thomas nodded, already assessing the situation as he stepped closer. "Let's take a look." He bent down, shining the flashlight under the hood. The engine bay was pristine, too clean for a car that had simply broken down. Something about it made Thomas pause, but he pushed the thought aside. He was here to help, not to judge. "Looks like the battery's dead," he said after a quick check. "I've got jumper cables in my truck. We'll have you back on the road in no time." The woman exhaled sharply, a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Thank you so much. I didn't know what I was going to do out here." "No worries," Thomas said with a small smile. "It happens." He jogged back to his truck, retrieved the cables, and returned to her car. The rain continued to pour, soaking through his jacket and chilling him to the bone. But Thomas barely noticed. Years of working in garages had taught him to focus on the task at hand. Within minutes he had the cables hooked up and the sedan's engine roaring back to life. The woman's face lit up, her earlier fear replaced by gratitude. "You're a lifesaver," she said, hugging her jacket tighter. Thomas waved off her thanks. "It's nothing. Just pay it forward one day." The woman hesitated, then extended her hand. "I'm Elena," she said. "Elena Parker." Thomas shook her hand, surprised at how firm her grip was despite the situation. "Thomas Green." "Thomas," Elena repeated, almost as if committing the name to memory. "I can't thank you enough, really. Let me pay you." "No need," Thomas interrupted, stepping back and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Just glad you're safe. Drive carefully, okay?" Elena looked like she wanted to argue, but instead she nodded. "Thank you again." Thomas watched as she climbed back into the car and drove off into the rain, her taillights disappearing into the storm. For a moment he stood there, the sound of the rain filling the silence. Then, shaking off the chill, he climbed back into his truck and headed home. By the time he walked through his front door, he was drenched and exhausted. He peeled off his wet clothes, tossed them into the laundry hamper, and sank onto the worn couch in his living room. The encounter lingered in his mind, but he brushed it aside as just another day. After all, he'd helped plenty of people over the years. He had no idea that this time, everything was about to change. Thomas woke up 2 days later, expecting nothing more than another ordinary Saturday. But life had other plans. As he sipped his morning coffee and stared out the kitchen window, his phone buzzed on the counter. He grabbed it, expecting a text from his boss or one of his neighbors. Instead, it was a call. "Thomas, you need to get home." "Right now," his neighbor's voice came through, sharp and urgent. Thomas frowned. "What's going on?" "There are 2 Royces parked in front of your house." Thomas blinked. What? I'm serious, man. Get over here. I think it's something big. Curiosity and concern collided in his chest as Thomas hung up and grabbed his keys. He couldn't shake the feeling that this had something to do with the woman in the rain. By the time he pulled into his driveway, his jaw dropped. 2 gleaming black Royces sat parked in front of his house, their polished exteriors gleaming even under the cloudy sky. A small group of people in sharp suits stood nearby, their expressions unreadable as they turned to watch him approach. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He stepped out of his truck cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel. Before he could speak, one of the suited men stepped forward, extending a hand. Mr. Green, the man said with a polite smile. We're here on behalf of Elena Parker. Thomas froze. Elena. And just like that, his world began to tilt. Thomas Green stood frozen in his driveway, staring at the 2 gleaming Royces parked in front of his modest home. The polished chrome reflected the gray clouds above, and the suited men standing near the vehicles looked so out of place against the backdrop of his weathered front porch and patchy lawn. The man who had spoken, a tall, clean-cut figure with sharp features and an air of authority, extended his hand again, patiently waiting for Thomas to respond. Mr. Green, the man repeated, his voice steady. My name is Michael Evans. I'm here on behalf of Elena Parker. Thomas blinked, still trying to process the words. Elena, the woman from the rain, the broken-down car. It felt like a lifetime ago, but it had only been 2 days. Wait, Elena Parker, Thomas asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. The woman I helped with her car. Michael nodded. That's correct. She wanted to express her gratitude in person and asked us to arrange transportation for you. If you're willing, we'd like to take you to meet her now. Thomas stared at the man, then at the Royces. Everything about this felt surreal, like something out of a movie. He half expected cameras to pop out of the bushes, revealing it all as some elaborate prank. I don't get it, Thomas said, narrowing his eyes. She already thanked me that night. Why all this? He gestured to the cars and the men in suits. Michael's polite smile didn't falter. Miss, Parker believes in showing appreciation in meaningful ways. She felt your kindness deserved more than just words. Thomas ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, still struggling to wrap his head around the situation. The rational part of him screamed to say no, this was too much, too strange. But there was another part, a quieter voice, whispering that maybe this was the kind of chance he'd been waiting for. After a long pause, Thomas straightened his shoulders and nodded. All right, he said, his voice steady despite the storm of questions swirling in his mind. Let's go. Michael's smile widened. Excellent. Please follow me. One of the drivers stepped forward and opened the door to the nearest Rolls-Royce. Thomas hesitated for only a moment before sliding into the plush leather seat. The scent of expensive leather and polished wood filled his senses, so far removed from the smell of motor oil and rust he was used to. The car pulled away smoothly, and as they drove through Maplewood, Thomas stared out the tinted windows. The familiar streets of his small town blurred by, giving way to rolling hills and sprawling estates he had only ever seen from a distance. The farther they went, the more out of place Thomas felt. Where are we going? He finally asked. Michael, seated across from him, folded his hands neatly in his lap. To Ms. Parker's estate. It's about an hour outside of town. Thomas let out a low whistle. An estate, huh? Guess she's doing pretty well for herself. Michael chuckled softly. You could say that. Miss Parker is the CEO of Parker Global Enterprises. She inherited the company from her father and expanded it into one of the largest private firms in the country. Thomas's eyes widened. Wait, what? And she was just stranded on the side of the road. Believe it or not, it happens, Michael said with a knowing smile. Even the most prepared people can have bad luck. Thomas leaned back in his seat, letting the information sink in. He had saved a CEO in the rain, and now he was being chauffeured to her estate in a Rolls-Royce. It was absurd, and yet here he was. The estate came into view just as the rain began to lighten. It was massive, larger than anything Thomas had ever seen in person. A long, winding driveway led through meticulously landscaped gardens, past fountains and rows of neatly trimmed hedges. At the end of the drive stood a mansion that looked more like a palace, its grand columns and towering windows gleaming even under the overcast sky. Thomas stepped out of the car slowly, his boots sinking slightly into the soft gravel. He took a moment to take it all in, feeling like he had just stepped into another world. Michael led him through the double doors, where a butler greeted them, and guided them through a series of hallways adorned with paintings, sculptures, and chandeliers that looked like they belonged in a museum. Finally, they reached a sunlit sitting room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. Standing by the window, dressed in an elegant yet understated outfit, was Elena Parker. She turned as they entered, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Thomas," she said, stepping forward, "I'm so glad you came." Thomas cleared his throat, suddenly very aware of his worn jeans and scuffed boots. Thanks for inviting me, I guess. Though I'm still not sure what's going on here." Elena laughed lightly, putting him at ease. "I imagine this is a lot to take in." She gestured to the room. "Please sit down. Let me explain." Thomas sank into one of the oversized chairs, doing his best not to fidget. Elena sat across from him, her expression softening. "You helped me when you didn't have to," she began. "That night I was scared, cold, and completely unprepared for what had happened. You didn't know who I was, but you still stopped and gave me your time and effort without expecting anything in return." Thomas shrugged. It was just the right thing to do. "Exactly," Elena said, her eyes shining. "And people like you, people who do the right thing without expecting rewards, are rare. That's why I wanted to thank you properly." Thomas frowned. "You already thanked me that night." Elena smiled. "Not like this." She nodded toward the butler, who returned moments later carrying a sleek leather folder and a set of keys, placing them carefully on the table. Thomas stared at them, then back at Elena. "What's this?" "This," she said, leaning forward, "is a gift. Inside the folder is a check, a substantial one. Enough to give you the freedom to chase your dreams. And the keys. They're to a brand new truck waiting outside, far more reliable than the one you've been driving." Thomas opened his mouth to protest, but Elena held up a hand. "There's more," she said. "I also want to offer you a job. A position here, managing the estate's transportation fleet and overseeing our mechanical operations. I need someone I can trust, someone hardworking and honest. And after what I saw that night, I know you're the right person for the job." Thomas stared at her, speechless. His world had just tilted again, and this time there was no going back. Thomas Green sat frozen in the oversized leather chair, staring at the leather folder and the gleaming set of keys resting on the polished coffee table. The air in the room felt heavier now, as if the weight of Elena Parker's offer had settled into every corner. A check. A brand new truck. And a job and opportunity that sounded too good to be true. Thomas blinked, then leaned back slightly, crossing his arms as if to shield himself from the surreal nature of the moment. He had spent years in greasy coveralls, his hands blackened with oil and grime, working paycheck to paycheck. And now here he was, sitting in a room that looked like it belonged in a magazine, being handed a lifeline he hadn't even asked for. He finally looked up at Elena, who watched him with a mixture of confidence and sincerity. Her posture was relaxed, but there was something searching in her eyes, like she was studying him, just as much as he was studying her. "Elena," Thomas started, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "I don't know what to say. This is a lot." She smiled softly and leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "I know it is, and I don't expect an answer right away. But I want you to know I'm serious. This isn't charity, Thomas. It's an opportunity, one I think you deserve." Thomas let out a breath, running a hand over his short-cropped hair. "Why me?" Elena tilted her head slightly, as if the question surprised her. "Because people like you don't come around often," she said simply. "When I was stuck on the side of that road, it would have been so easy for you to keep driving. Most people would have. But you stopped. You didn't ask for anything in return. You just helped." She paused, her gaze steady. "I've spent my life surrounded by people who only care about what they can take: money, power, influence. You reminded me that there's more to the world than that. And I need people like you in my life, in my business, people I can trust." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Trust," You barely know me." "I know enough," Elena said, her voice firm. "And I've done my homework." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Elena leaned back slightly, offering a small smile. "After that night, I wanted to know more about the man who helped me, so I made a few calls. Turns out you have a reputation in Maplewood, not just for fixing cars, but for helping people. Carl at the garage said he doesn't know what he'd do without you. Your neighbors told me you're the first one to show up when someone's in trouble and the last one to leave when the work's not done." Thomas swallowed hard, unsure how to feel about being researched. Part of him bristled at the idea, but another part, the part that had spent so long feeling invisible, felt an unexpected twinge of pride. "And what about my past?" he asked quietly. "The struggles? The mistakes? Did you find out about those too?" Elena's expression softened. "Everyone has a past, Thomas. But what matters to me is who you are now and who you could be if given the chance." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint hum of rain against the windows. Finally, Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What exactly does this job involve?" Elena's face brightened slightly, as if she knew she'd just won the first battle. "You manage the estate's fleet, everything from maintenance to upgrades. We have several vehicles for staff and business operations, not to mention the classic cars in my father's collection. I need someone who understands machines and takes pride in their work. Someone like you." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Classic cars?" Elena grinned. "Dozens of them. Some are rare collectibles. My father was passionate about restoring them, but after he passed, the collection fell into disrepair. I'd love to see it brought back to life." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Restoring classic cars had always been his dream, the one goal he had quietly tucked away in the back of his mind, believing it was out of reach. And now, here it was, being handed to him on a silver platter. But dreams didn't come without risks. "What's the catch?" he asked cautiously. Elena shook her head. "No catch. The salary is generous and the position includes housing here on the estate if you want it. All I ask is that you treat the job the same way you treated me that night, with care and integrity." Thomas leaned back again, exhaling slowly. He could feel the pull of the offer, like a current sweeping him away from the life he'd always known. And yet, the thought of leaving that life, the garage, his home, the people who relied on him, felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing what was at the bottom. "Can I think about it?" he asked finally. "Of course," Elena said, rising from her chair. "Take as much time as you need. But I have a feeling you already know what you want." She extended her hand, and Thomas stood, shaking it firmly. Despite the storm still raging outside, the warmth in her grip steadied him. "I'll be in touch," Elena said. "And Thomas, whatever you decide, thank you. For that night. And for trusting me enough to come here today." Thomas nodded, still unsure of what the future held, but feeling, for the first time in years, that maybe, just maybe, his life was about to change for the better. As he left the estate and climbed back into the Rolls-Royce, his reflection stared back at him in the rearview mirror, a man caught between the past and the future, ready to face whatever came next. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.